All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today we are going to be talking about land use planning for climate change. And my name is Janda. I am an energy project manager at Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. Just a caveat, I am not a professional planner. I have a background in municipal government, but I work on energy projects related to climate change. And the information that I'm going to share with you today, I put together with my colleagues who are professional planners. Jens Hilke has put this all together, and he is a conservation planning biologist at Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and he will be presenting to you in the second half of this presentation. Okay, so a few technical details. While we're doing the presentation, if you'd like to turn off your video, we'll have better bandwidth. And if you could also turn off your microphone while we are doing the presenting, that would be awesome. For those of you who are able to access the chat feature in Teams, go ahead and put in your name and the municipality or organization that you work for into the chat. If you'd like to put questions in the chat while we're presenting, we can keep an eye on those, but we'll be answering questions in between the sections that we're presenting to you today. Anything else, Jens, before I move on?
Nope, we're good to go. Thanks.
Great. So the agenda for today is we're going to talk just a little bit about greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont and the importance of planning and land use regulations to respond to climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm going to talk about some tools that our organization has put together for planning compact, walkable neighborhoods in your town centers. And then Jens is going to talk about protecting the natural landscape and keeping it intact for climate change resilience, as well as ecosystem and wildlife connectivity. Okay, so hopefully you can all see this graph of greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. This came from the Energy Action Network website, where you can get quite a lot of information on the current status of greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. Transportation is the largest emitting sector, so that's cars, vehicles, and most of the emissions do come from light duty cars, people just going to work and doing their thing in their cars. Secondly, the second largest emitter is homes, and that's from thermal processes, so heating homes and hot water heating with fossil fuel sources is causing those emissions. So you'll see next the electricity sector. In Vermont, emissions are very, very low, and that is because things have changed dramatically since 2017, when there were new regulations given to the electric distributors in Vermont to move to carbon-free energy. And right now, Green Mountain Power says that they're 100% carbon-free. So there's just a little bit left lingering of fossil fuel that goes through the electric grid. So switching to electricity is one of the high impact actions that people can take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And there are a few other emitters, including agriculture, industrial processes, and waste. So what we're going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about, my part of this presentation is the importance of land use planning in terms of creating compact walkable neighborhoods or high density in areas that are planned for growth. So let me just dig into that a little bit. The difference between low density and high density is, low density development uses more energy for heating and cooling because it tends to encourage larger building footprints with higher heating and cooling needs. It tends to put people out in somewhat sprawling suburban areas, which results in more driving, less access to public transportation or walking and biking, and results in the loss of nature, the loss of forests, the loss of natural habitats, and the corresponding carbon sequestration and storage. So what I'm going to talk about is how to use your land use planning regulations to create or incentivize compact walkable neighborhoods in your town centers, which are areas that are already developed and are planned for growth. So compact high density development encourages smaller building footprints with lower heating and cooling needs, allows for less driving, more walking, more biking, close to public transportation, and then enables the conservation of the surrounding rural areas and natural habitats for carbon sequestration. So along those same lines, we want to think about land use patterns. Density, high density I know it's something that we don't necessarily love as Vermonters, but if you do it in the right places, you can protect the wildlife and the ecosystems outside of the urban areas. And this will protect forests, river corridors, wetlands, etc. And I want to point out the image on the right, which shows how in rural areas, building envelopes can also be planned to encourage more forest, to keep wildlife connectivity by having a smaller building envelope, less of a driveway. And I also want to point out that this is all coming from a document that I and my colleagues put together at Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. And hopefully, Jens, if it's not already there, you'll be able to put that in the chat for more information on these types of things. So again, the effects of low density, or what we would call sprawl, it enables fragmented forests, destruction of wetlands, and loss of, the beautiful natural areas in Vermont. Encourages larger homes, more driving, more stormwater runoff, and ultimately more greenhouse gas emissions. So very important for climate change to address this in land use planning. So in that document that I mentioned, my colleagues and I put together a list of tools that municipalities can use to put in their land use regulations to incentivize compact, walkable town centers. The first being no minimum lot sizes in areas planned for growth. Again, we're just talking about areas that are already developed and you're planning for growth. Having no minimum lot sizes can be really useful in enabling infill. And removing maximum residential density rather than just increasing density. If you remove density standards altogether in areas planned for growth, that can really also incentivize development where you want it, as well as lowering minimum parking standards, and also planning for infrastructure like water and sewer. We also recommend adopting an official map so that municipal officials, as well as developers, can really understand what's going to happen in the future and where to put buildings and where to develop. The official map identifies future facilities such as public buildings and recreational paths, and provides a vision of what the town will look like. Rather than just having your zoning areas on a map, you can actually have a map that shows the future municipality. And then also allowing more than one primary structure on a lot. But there's really no need to limit each lot to one building. This severely limits density. Again, this would just be done in areas that are planned for growth. And then adopting permissive non-conforming structure rules. Essentially what that means is that certain building upgrades and expansions could happen just with administrative review rather than going through a whole development review board process. And then lastly, simplifying use regulations. What this means is that instead of requiring certain housing types and then others having to need a conditional use approval, larger developments such as duplexes, triplexes, and small apartments could be allowed by right, making that much easier for developers and would really incentivize more density in the areas that you want in town centers. So I want to give you an example of a municipality that has very recently made one of these changes, a very big change, and that's Williston. Recently removed their maximum density standards in areas planned for growth. So the example here is Wright Avenue in Williston. The top image is what it looks like today. And as you can see, it's already developed. It has a lot of pavement on it. It's very car centric. This isn't necessarily somewhere where you'd want to go without your car. There is some nature, but not really any considerable amount that would assist with carbon sequestration or storage. So in removing the density standards and enabling much higher density in this area, the vision for the future of Wright Avenue is a compact, walkable area where people are going to want to go on foot and with their bicycles, and there will be all kinds of things to see and do along Wright Avenue, and much greater density, as you can see. And this is at Taft Corners. This is a recent change. We don't know of any other municipality in Chittenden County that has completely removed density standards in areas planned for growth. However, there are some like Heinsberg who recently very much increased their density standards in areas planned for growth. So it's a step in the right direction. So that's also another option if that's more politically feasible. So we often get questions from planning commissions and energy committees. Can we put into our land regulations that people have to have solar energy here, or do this with their buildings or that with their buildings? It's important to distinguish between land use regulations and building code. Land use regulations, or what we call zoning, it's meant to regulate land use, not how buildings are constructed. And it can't legally, land use regulations can't legally regulate how buildings are constructed and what's on them, such as solar panels. However, you can do certain things in your land use regulations, like adopting a regulation to require a minimum portion of parking lots be designed to accommodate solar power. You can't say in your land use regulations that solar power is required, because land use regulations don't govern that. The Public Utilities Commission is what approves all renewable energy generation. So that would be the process. But that's one thing you can do, is make parking lots solar ready in your regulations. And other things like creating lighting standards that avoid overlighting, requiring LEDs or efficient fixtures, and also requiring electric vehicle ready buildings so that charging is provided to residents when buildings are constructed. And also, just lastly, making your land use regulations friendly to electric vehicle charging. You know, not having any standards about that would be the easiest thing. So if you're a municipality that doesn't have a lot of resources around either developing land use regulations or changing your land use regulations, your regional planning commission can assist you. So the document I've been referring to that we developed is called Climate Change and Land Use, and it is on the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission website. But if you are not in Chittenden County, I've provided here a map of all of the regional planning commissions in Vermont. So there is one in your area for sure that you can contact, and it is their job to assist with planning needs. So never hesitate to reach out to your regional planning commission for assistance with any of these types of things. Okay, so that is my presentation, and it's now time for questions.
Okay, we have a hand up from Alan B. of Essex. Go ahead, Alan.
Hey, thank you. So you're talking about parking regulations, and I noticed that our town has some parking regulations referring to how many parking spots there have to be relative to the size of the store and how many people are supposed to be in it. And that was developed by some agency somewhere. I feel like it results in huge parking lagoons, and I'd like to try to figure out a way, something with some science behind it, to say, how can we change this? I wanted to ask if there were any resources about maybe more climate cognizant parking regulations that I could refer to.
So the document that I mentioned that Lincoln linked to in the chat has a little bit of information on that. You could also reach out to your regional planning commission on that as well.
Okay, Karen McKnight, go ahead.
You're muted, Karen.
Okay, I'm sorry. One of the limitations in the town where I live, which is Underhill, is that there seem to be so many things that are grandfathered in. So right now, there have been, in this last year and a half, development in areas where forest blocks have been cut down, wildlife corridors have been interfered with, and part of the problem has been that there was a subdivision way back in the 60s or early 70s, and at that time anything went, 10-acre lots and things like that. So is there some way to, I don't want to say get around, but we're hit with that a lot in areas that are now critical to wildlife?
I will follow up with our planner at CCRPC and ask that question. You said that there are subdivisions that are, or certain types of development that's been grandfathered in, even though it's the regulations have changed?
That's correct.
Okay. And what to do about that? Okay.
Yeah.
I will find out for you.
Yeah, one in particular off Pleasant Valley Road, which is just a tragedy. So.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
I'll get back to you.
All right, I don't see any more hands up. Nothing in the chat. Jens, do you want to go ahead with the next section?
Yeah, sounds great. And are you seeing the Fish and Wildlife screen?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks, Anne, for that. I just wanted to start with a little bit of context about where I'm coming from. I'm with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and we believe in the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. Lincoln and I work for the Community Wildlife Program, and we serve all 268 municipalities and 11 regional planning commissions. We work very closely with our colleagues in the RPCs, and Lincoln and I do a lot of night meetings with towns, conservation commissions, planning commissions. Our assistance is free to you, and we're happy to help on anything that relates to land use planning for fish and wildlife. So I wanted to start by thinking about forest fragmentation. And that's the process of large blocks of forest becoming bisected by roads and development. And that creates smaller and smaller patches of forest. And now this process has wide effects. And so I just wanted to start with thinking about the forest products economy. And so when we have smaller and smaller blocks of forest, practicing forestry becomes operationally impractical. And it's frankly difficult to make any money if you're trying to log a 3-acre lot. So if we want to continue having a working landscape and that contribution to our economy, and then the continued flow of forest goods and services depends on having healthy forests and enough land to practice that forestry. This trend towards smaller and smaller blocks of forest also has impacts for recreation and tourism, whether we're talking about summer visitors or fall foliage. Operating in a smaller block of forest, frankly, degrades the recreational experience, and it increases the potential for land use conflicts. Recreationists and hunters, or recreation and logging, whatever it might be, we increase that likelihood of conflict. And then there's this decline in public access to these lands for forest-based recreation. And that certainly includes hunting and fishing, but mountain biking and everything else as well. This trend towards forest fragmentation also impacts clean water and flood protection. If we have smaller blocks of forest, there's less ability to filter the water, and less of that water is going into the ground. So more of it is moving over the surface, which is going to in turn cause more erosion and less groundwater recharge. In the city centers, that means more stormwater that we then have to deal with in our stormwater system. You'd think we learned this lesson. In the 1927 flood, there was considerably less forest cover than there is today. And the effects of all that rain happening so quickly made everything dramatically worse because of this diminished ability of the forest to absorb water. Not only that, this process of forest fragmentation is also accounts for releasing more carbon that's stored in the soil and the vegetation. And then it reduces the capacity of our forest to store that carbon, and also reduces the ability to filter out particulates and other pollutants in the air, as well as the capacity to buffer severe weather impacts. Of course, forest fragmentation is affecting wildlife and biological diversity. With more roads bisecting our forest, there's going to be more roadkill. Whether it's, smoother road is going to have vehicles traveling faster and eventually a higher traffic volume. And that's going to create more danger to animals and also to the traveling public. The presence of these roads is also going to change the way animals behave. They're going to try and stay away from those roads. And that in turn is going to increase the likelihood that whole populations become inbred and begin to decline because of this lack of genetic exchange. And then lastly, forest fragmentation is impacting human health. Smaller blocks of forest have more edge around the outside, right? So that's going to increase the incidence of tick-borne illness like Lyme disease. It also means we're losing our rural character and something of what makes Vermont, Vermont. Now, Anne had showed you earlier about some of the carbon projections. Let me just mention this one. In Vermont, what we're expecting, I often generally say warmer and wetter. Already we're seeing a 4 degree increase, 4 degrees Fahrenheit temperature increase in the winter. Spring is arriving 2 weeks earlier, which doesn't sound so bad here at the beginning of winter, but it's certainly having an effect. And precipitation has increased by almost 7 inches. We also know that there's a disproportionate effect on Vermonters, and that some Vermonters are frontline communities, BIPOC, LGBTQ2 communities, all sorts of individuals, all sorts of folks are disproportionately affected by climate change. So the effects are not even. The effects are not just warmer and wetter. We're also getting severe droughts. We're getting short-term droughts. We're getting increasing severe weather events. So the impacts of climate change are much more complicated than just warmer and wetter. Now, wildlife are on the move in response to this changing climate. And so you could say that climate change is making this problem of forest fragmentation even more dangerous. The Nature Conservancy estimates that entire populations are moving north and south away from the equator about 1 mile per year. That's entire populations, not just individuals. Now, this map shows the average direction that mammals, birds, and amphibians need to move to track hospitable climates as they shift across the landscape. And please see how much of that is funneled through the Northeast and through Vermont. So we're seeing this with climate change, this increased pressure to move, and yet fragmentation, forest fragmentation, limits those connections for animals to connect the blocks. Okay, so as we're thinking about this adaptation side of climate change, not just the carbon mitigation side, we need to understand that forest fragmentation is creating a pattern that's making it difficult for wildlife to move, and it's ultimately going to threaten the viability of our wildlife populations into the future. Wildlife are moving in response to changing climate, and so adapting to climate change really means ensuring that we have this connected land use pattern that allows for plant and animal movement. Okay, so that was just this forest fragmentation piece, and I'll stop and ask, are there any questions in the chat? Or anyone on mute?
Okay, nothing in the chat right now, but feel free to raise your hand or just unmute and go ahead with the question for Jens.
So this isn't a question, but I did want to point out, I heard on the news recently that a bear was recently hit on a major highway in Vermont and died, a young bear. And the person reporting about it was saying, why don't they just stay in the forest? Which really made me sad, because we've just completely, put this really dangerous area right in the middle of their habitat, right in the middle of the forest. So something to think about as we grow, making sure that we don't repeat that, in too many places. So just wanted to point that out. It's happening now. It happens every day.
Yeah, thanks for that. And bear aren't going to sweat to death in response to climate change. The danger is that they're being forced to move and then crossing the road. So this is very much, roadkill, and increasing roadkill is very much a climate change issue. Okay, I'm just going to keep going, and then we'll have time again at the end. So now I really wanted to dig into keeping working and natural landscapes intact for climate resilience. And I'll start by looking at the 2018 Newfane Town Plan. And I have great things to say about this town plan. It's really excellent language related to forest fragmentation, climate change, and adaptation. It does a really good job of building the case, beginning with wildlife resources and then going into forest and ultimately into land use pattern. So I know that folks at the Regional Planning Commission provided technical assistance on this plan, and it's really excellent. So here in the wildlife resources section, you can see that they're talking about avoiding fragmentation of large blocks and maintaining the connectivity between those blocks. And then they call for encouraging clustering of development and protecting this habitat through development of land use regulations. In the forest block section, they get into talking about the larger pattern of forest fragmentation and how rural sprawl is really driving that. And then the effect that that has on forestry, the economy, and even our culture. So there's really excellent language out there in town plans that other towns can use, borrow, to strengthen their own town planning. And really highlight these issues and come up with some ideas on ways to address them. But I just want to connect some dots while we're thinking about Newfane, and also show how we need to integrate this understanding of land use pattern into all parts of a town's planning and regulatory framework. So at left, you can see Newfane highlighted in purple, and this the orange on this map is from Vermont Conservation Design. That's on the BioFinder website, and we'll put that a link to the BioFinder website in the chat as well. I'm just throwing link in a curveball here, but it shows this highest priority connectivity blocks. That's what's in orange. And now these are the forests in Vermont that form a connected pattern from the Berkshires and the Taconics down south up to the Sutton Mountains of Quebec, or the White Mountains of New Hampshire, or the Adirondacks. These are the connected forests in Vermont that allow for wildlife movement, north, south, east, west, all over. So the black arrow on the slide shows this important area for wildlife movement on the western side of Newfane. It makes perfect sense when you see it at this scale. It really shows up as that corridor. But most towns are looking inside the box of their regulatory authority. And so, an important piece of thinking about land use planning for climate change is really zooming out and seeing that larger ecological context. So at right, you can see those same connectivity blocks within Newfane, and I'll just highlight that road section that appears white up here in the north. Okay, so now these are Newfane zoning districts, and so there's a resource district that includes areas of land that serve as watershed areas and are characterized by steep slopes, shallow soils, important for wildlife habitat. That's the RE on the map. And then there's this rural district that comprises areas which are already committed to development, easily accessible, and so forth. So you can see on the map that the zoning protects the integrity of that north-south corridor. Here, I'll just protects that with its resource district. Okay, well, that's great. But now let's look at the proposed land use map. And you can see that into the future, Newfane is thinking about allowing for that rural district to continue east-west across that area. So again, I'm just trying to show you how we have this understanding in the town plan language about connectivity and forest pattern. It's even protected in the zoning, and yet it's not in all parts of the town plan or the sort of planning framework for the town. So it's just a reminder to us all to really connect the dots between those chapters and make for that consistent vision and make sure that this understanding of connectivity is not only protected in zoning, but also exists in the future land use maps that we publish in our. Okay, so here's another example, and I want to talk about Bolton's zoning rewrite. At left, you see the 2005 zoning map. Now, the yellow is their conservation district. So that's a zoning district for conservation. And then in green is their forest district, really with a purpose statement, talks about forestry as the primary use there. And then that stippled area in the middle here that is their rural residential district. Okay, now we know that overwhelmingly Vermont is growing in these rural residential districts. We're not appreciably increasing in our village centers and downtowns. We're overwhelmingly sprawling into these rural residential districts. These rural districts have some of the lowest standards for maintaining a land use pattern or clustering development. And so, you know, overwhelmingly, those resource districts are the problem. So here's what Bolton did when they rewrote their zoning. The first thing is you notice there's a huge increase in the conservation district. That's not as dramatic as it looks. A lot of those lands were already subject to Act 250 deed restrictions. And so the Planning Commission just wanted to call a spade a spade. Those places weren't going to get developed into the future, so they just decided to put them in the conservation district and acknowledge what was already legally binding, no development. But then you'll also see the forestry district has increased and changed. And so in particular, I want to show you that spot. And that spot brings this connected pattern of forest, in this case working forest, down to the highway where they have a flood hazard protection district associated with the Winooski River. And it also brings that district right down next to Pineo Brook Culvert. And so there's this opportunity to allow for wildlife movement under I-89 that also connects down here to permanently conserved land in Duxbury. So through their zoning and the change of the district boundaries, they've been able to create this land use pattern that allows for wildlife movement north-south across one of Vermont's greatest barriers to wildlife movement. That's the highway. Okay, while we're talking about land use districts, this is Waitsfield, and you can see that Forest Reserve District on the right-hand side, and that's a huge chunk of the Northfield Range. I believe it's everything above 1,700 feet elevation. And you can see the purpose statement of the district. The purpose of the Forest Reserve is to protect significant forest resources and the water supply at higher elevations, and to limit development in places with steep slopes or shallow soils, unique or fragile resources. When you zoom out, you can see that same chunk of the Northfield Range and just what an important forest block that is and how that allows for wildlife movement. I believe actually the Northfield Range is the largest uninterrupted by a road forest ridgeline that we have in Vermont. And so the town of Waitsfield, through its Forest Reserve District, was able to strengthen that connectivity north to south. I'll also just point out on this map, look how difficult, or look how close east-west movement is across the Mad River Valley. That's the Camel's Hump block, that darkest color. It's a 54,000 acre forest block. I'm not talking about ownership, I'm just talking about forest cover. And so this is a spot in northern Waitsfield where those two ranges get very close together and really allow for this opportunity for east-west movement as well as north-south. Okay, so you know, in the different parts of our landscape, there are different resources that that contribute to connectivity. So I've done a lot of work with South Burlington over the years, and they have their riparian network is what really is knitting together these forest fragments. What you're seeing on screen in blue is the town boundary. The green are the highest priority areas in Vermont conservation design. And you can also see the way the streams, those small linear features, really knit together those forest districts. My point here is many towns have stream buffer ordinances or other sorts of protections for water quality. These are benefiting connectivity. They are benefiting that larger pattern. And they may not mention the words forest or climate change or anything like that. So all of our climate-related policies aren't going to be neatly tucked into one part of the town planning or regulatory framework. Here we can see these different, the classification of natural resources and how they have different standards in different places. The habitat overlay district, the floodplains, the wetlands. So there are different protections in different parts of their regulatory framework that all work together to improve this pattern. Okay, I'm just going to jump around, go up north now. This is Enosburgh. It's a town right on the border between the Champlain Valley and the Green Mountains. This is their zoning map. And in orange is their agricultural zone, and the large white space is their rural residential district. I already mentioned my concerns with rural residential districts, and you can see just what a huge chunk of the town that is. But Enosburgh actually adopted driveway standards in this rural residential district. And development proposals that include new roads and driveways of greater than 800 feet require conditional use. So that's not saying they're a no-go, it's just a heightened level of review type of standard. But that's one way of limiting that sprawl into these forest blocks that are in the rural residential. Okay, now there are a variety of resources that I want to share with you. At left is a book by Vermont Natural Resources Council. We have VNRC staff are actually on the webinar today, and this is an excellent publication, Community Strategies, that has a separate chapter for each of these different regulatory and non-regulatory tools for addressing forests and wildlife. So that's a great one to get into chapter by chapter to learn more about the tools. Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage is the department's publication on how to use BioFinder and Vermont Conservation Design to do land use planning. So that's the step-by-step guide in terms of understanding those maps that I showed you, the orange connectivity blocks or the green highest priority areas. How do you take that information and apply it to your town scale and bring it into your town's planning and regulatory framework? And then at right is the Agency of Commerce and Community Development's Municipal Planning Manual. This is a great document for learning more about the planning process, whether you're writing a new plan or updating an existing plan. There's all sorts of resources there on community participation and how to do meetings and all sorts of great stuff. So that's another excellent resource that I wanted to share with you. And then here, as I'm wrapping up, I just wanted you to know that conservation in Vermont is overwhelmingly paid for by hunters and anglers through license fees and an excise tax on guns and ammo and rods and reels. But anyone can support conservation in Vermont through purchase of the habitat stamp. And no, that's not a US postal stamp. It's actually more like a sticker that you can put on a window or a bumper to show that you support wildlife in Vermont. And it directly supports conservation of wildlife habitat. And then at right, you can also donate to the Non-Game Wildlife Fund on your tax return. Okay, so we have plenty of time for questions, but I just wanted to end by putting our contact information here on screen. And thank you so much for attending today. I hope that was helpful and informative. And again, we do have time for questions. So I'm just going to stop the share and Lincoln, please.
Okay, great. So we have a question from Karen. You can unmute yourself and please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Jens. Thank you, Anne, for presenting. Appreciate it, as always. So in Facein, as you know, we've got a lot of forest blocks that we don't want to disrupt, but we definitely are feeling the pressures of the housing crisis in the Mad River Valley. We have a housing summit coming up October 12th. And, you know, we in Facein specifically are looking at our land use regs and looking at getting a grant for bylaw modernization to specifically look at housing and what we can do in our rural community to help that. As you know, it's really hard to balance, those environmental factors and housing. And we are feeling a lot of pressure from the public in our community to make things easier from a land use perspective. And it's really tough to find that balance and convey the importance of the environmental impacts to the public. That being said, I do think, decreasing parking spots and duplex and triplex and things like that are great. We can't get around our transportation issue right now in Facein, though things are being, progress is being made in Waitsfield. So long story short, I'm wondering, Anne, if you've seen in Chittenden County, maybe in Huntington or Heinsberg might be good examples. Do you know if they've implemented any duplex, triplex regs, and if they're seeing any impacts of that? Thank you.
I don't know the answer to that question. I can follow up for you. Just gonna write that down, Heinsberg and Huntington. I do know that they have really increased density in the village center, and there's quite a lot of development that's been queued up. So I think there's going to be almost 100 new units built in the next couple of years in the village of Heinsberg. And yeah, some people were taken by surprise by that, but it's just because they were not following what the Planning Commission was doing over the last 10 years or so. So I know that, Heinsberg's density in the areas planned for growth are definitely going to increase very soon, but I can follow up. I can follow up with Heinsberg and find out about duplexes and apartments. Is that what you're interested in?
Well, I'm interested in the Huntington Heinsberg relationship is probably somewhat similar to the Facein Waitsfield relationship in that Waitsfield has a village designation, right? And Facein does not. And we're not looking at, we've kind of evaluated some options for that, but creating any sort of downtown or village designation for us isn't in our near future term. So yeah, duplexes, triplexes, maybe I could reach out to them too. In Huntington, I'm kind of curious because they're comparable to Facein in our ecological makeup. But yeah. Thank you.
Karen, I'll just add, I've been working with Facein for a long time. We started 2012 with the Forest Wildlife Communities Project. And Facein has overwhelmingly used steep slopes to limit development. And that was the principal regulatory tool. And that's not enough to guide pattern. But what Waitsfield has done in terms of looking at the housing overlay and then adding into that a review of forest blocks and connectivity is a good process in terms of your relationship with the public or their relationship with the public for saying, yes, we're concerned about housing. Yes, we want to make housing easier and we're going to create an overlay district to do that. But we don't want our housing overlay district in places that are bad for our pattern and crossings of Route 100 in particular. So my point is just it was a crazy couple years in Waitsfield that I was working with them to do both the housing overlay and the forest block remapping. But it was great for the public to understand we're concerned about both of these. They're both priorities and they're interwoven.
Thank you. Yeah, one last comment on that is that what we're seeing in Facein itself, I do agree, valley-wide, I think that was received very well. I think people have very short-term memory, but in Facein, we're definitely seeing people come in front of our DRB and now to our Planning Commission meetings with complaints about how difficult it is to build. And without that understanding of, steep slopes, et cetera, it's a little challenging for sure. Thank you.
Any other questions out there?
Yeah, we still have a few minutes. Please feel free.
Quiet, I guess you said it all.
All right. Well, folks, please don't hesitate to contact us offline or separately from this. We're happy to answer questions and provide technical assistance. So please do let us know if we can be of help to you. Ellen, I just see you're coming off mute. Do you have a question?
I just wanted to say thank you.
You're very welcome.
Big
Have a
time.
great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.